And I'll talk loudly because you should be going to say something to that.
Yeah, I'll say something.
Actually, so just reposition it. Okay, that should be a little better.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming to this public interview from the Platypus Affiliate Society is hosting with our comrade and long-term collaborator, Andy Blunden. This is going to be a relatively informal dialogue, in some sense part of a continuation of a dialogue I personally have been having with Andy, but also more broadly that Andy has been having with our Platypus chapter here. We had him on a panel in 2023 on the legacy of 1968, which was quite provocative, and I encourage everyone to go find the video. I'll share it in the description of the event. And he's also been on a prior panel, I think in 2021, on Hegel and the left, on an online panel with Platypus. So it's been great to have this long-running interaction with Andy, particularly on the subject of Hegel and Marx. This is going to be 2 one-hour sessions, or we'll see how much time we take. The first hour is going to be more around the sort of history and philosophy aspects of Marx and Hegel, very roughly, and the second one is going to be on Andy's new books and sort of a relation between Marx's Captial and Hegel's philosophy of right, but more broadly under that is the relation of the state, society, politics, and the way that the two different thinkers understand those concepts. So just to start, I might just say a short biography of Andy, but that will also lead into our next question. Andy is a red diaper baby. His parents were a member of the Communist Party, and then in 1966 he was drafted to go to the Vietnam War, and he very famously was one of the first people in Australia to publicly burn his draft card, and there's an infamous photo of Andy out there. He left to go to England to escape the draft, and while in England he started studying his PhD, but he also started studying Marxism more seriously, and you joined the Workers' Revolutionary Party there. And it was during that time that I believe you encountered and started taking Hegel very seriously for the first time. After the collapse of that movement, he moved back to Australia in 1985, where he's continued to run reading groups and political activities. Sort of a lot of people around the world know you as one of the main online publishers of Hegel and Marx. You've been a prolific contributor to the Marxist.org Internet Archive, and very early you also put some of the very early Hegel available publicly online, so the world is indebted to you, and many Marxists and scholars around the world find they're reading transcriptions by Andy Blunden of many obscure texts that somehow you've found the time to transcribe. That's a very brief history, but perhaps just if you could elaborate on that, could you start off by giving us a bit of an engagement of your history of your engagement with Marx and Hegel, and how they came to you at various points in your life, and why you found Marx and Hegel engaging.
I should say, I was a red diaper kid. My parents were that kind of communists that believed that children should make up their own mind about politics. So I didn't know they'd be members of the Communist Party until after I burnt my draft card. I thought they were going to just be upset about that. Of course, they were absolutely delighted. Equally, it was in 1968 that I first started reading Marxism as a direct response to the events of that time, and started getting my reading from the communist bookshops in London. Eventually, I joined the Workers' Revolutionary Party, Healy's outfit. My time could have been better spent, but I spent 13 years party building as a good party member and paper seller in that outfit. Now, the Hegel comes in because of the WRP identified as seeing theory as very important, and sort of regarded themselves as theoretically superior to other sects. Though we were astoundingly ignorant of history, there was a big emphasis on studying philosophy. And the form that this took was, I began with a series of lectures that Healy gave reading out and commenting on Lenin's annotations on Hegel's logic. So, I don't know if he understood a word he was saying, actually. He was dyslexic, and you'd talk about casuality, and the profound idea of casuality. The word he was reading was, of course, causality. And if you haven't recognized the connection of the word with cause and effect, what the hell can you mean? But nevertheless, it's in the nature of the sect, we were all directed to study Lenin's annotations on Hegel. Now, unlike others who I'm sure to this day wouldn't remember a word of what was said at that time, I went out and bought a copy of The Science of Logic and The Shorter Logic and reproduced Lenin's underlinings and comments in my own copies, and then studied them with Lenin looking over my shoulder, so to speak. But this I kept secret, because if I think in the sect of knowing I've been doing this, this is not what we were expected to do. But this is how I first engaged with Hegel. So that brings you up to 1985, when the whole formation exploded into about 9 different parts, and I returned to Australia. Then I didn't really engage with Hegel at all for a while. Engaged myself mainly in vain efforts to build a Trotsky-like party in Australia, in Melbourne specifically. But around about the mid-90s, I did start up a little, I had one reading of a Hegel reading group, and we started on the doctrine of being, which was, in my view at the time, the proper place to start. I don't think that now. And the second, a week later, really, when I sat down for the second reading, no one turned up. So I chased down people and said, "Look, why didn't you come?" I said, "Andy, it's too difficult." So that's a capture of the state of reception of Hegel in the mid-90s. I think there were probably some academics in academia somewhere studying Hegel, and during the Hegel summer schools that I ran from 1997 up until 2010 about, we found some of these people, but there was a complete disjuncture of that study of Hegel with the movement. The proliferation of Hegel reading groups in the past few years is really remarkable, because from not being able to get people to attend after the first one, I don't know, I can't keep a track of the number of Hegel reading groups going on. So, going from Lenin's annotations and his comments, I read the logic as a materialist theory of knowledge. And it's not entirely without merit, but it's a limited view of Hegel. Later, when I ran a sort of conference thing on the philosophy of right, so I had to get to read it myself. I might say for these Hegel summer schools, I was running these things with about 6 months familiarity with Hegel myself. Right? Incredible cheek. But that's the way I've always done it. And I was copy typing this stuff onto the internet and learning, because people that were interested in Hegel were contacting me for about the first 3 or 4 years after it went on, the text went online. I had ongoing conversation with other people. So that's how I learned my Hegel. Now, come back a little bit. Around about the late 90s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist parties in Eastern Europe, there was a movement called Back to the Real Marx. And I was readily attracted to that, because a lot of us became to realize that we had inherited a Marxism which had little connection with Marx himself. But Marx was the real genius, and everyone was trying to identify with Marx, but really what we learned was a product of mainly the Third, but also the Fourth International, and this was really something different. So there were a few people, sort of intellectual types, that said, we've got to go back to the real Marx. Cyril Smith wrote a book called Marx at the Millennium, in which he gave a somewhat idiosyncratic but very close reading of Marx. And so I became involved in that. And that was part, of course, of joining the Marxist Indian archive and participating in putting all these texts online. But as soon as you started to get back to the real Marx, you became aware of, well, to understand Marx, I've got to understand Hegel. Because Hegel was very obvious in Marx's early writings, he's responding to Hegel. So then I started reading Hegel. And that's all happening really so as I said, I already knew Hegel, but suddenly this became more important and I made a serious study of it. I might say then as soon as I started to read Hegel, I realised that I had to be familiar with the history of philosophy to know what the hell Hegel was about. And so I only went back as far as the Copernican revolution, but I spent about a year reading my way through Western philosophy from Galileo up until sort of contemporary times, and so I could understand what they were arguing about. Right? And it's in that context that I came to the view that if you have a logic, it has to be a logic of something. Logic, as it's understood in its narrowest sense, in the schools of logic and what you learn at school, is a propositional logic, where from this proposition, that proposition follows. But the contents of the proposition themselves is not part of the logic. If this is true and that's true, then that's true or isn't true or doesn't follow. But it has to be a logic of something. You can have quantum logic, or you can have the logic of the class struggle, the logic of history. Right? It has to be a logic of something. It can't just be logic. So what is the logic of? And I came to the conclusion it's the logic of human practice in general. So on that, that's the spirit in which I've read the logic ever since.
Right, can I ask on that, after that intense study of Hegel, did you come back to reconsider Lenin's annotations? Did you revisit them at some point and give them a second look?
Well, I really had studied them so thoroughly, I didn't need to go back to read them. It was all in there. That was the nature of the Hegellian formation. Such a fight could happen over words. I simply recognised the limitations of him. Much later, quite recently, I went back again to ask myself the question, did Lenin read the idea of cognition, which as you would know is the second last chapter of the logic, and in my more recent thinking of, say, the last 5 or 6 years, this chapter has emerged as being of crucial importance. And I found that the excerpt itself goes for about 12 pages, and Lenin had copied out long sections from every one of those pages. So whatever we make of Lenin, he was not ignorant of that passage, and yet when he wrote, in summing up what he had learned, I won't get it word perfect, but it's something like, it is impossible to understand Marx's Captial without first having understood the whole of the logic, big capital letters and italics, especially its first chapter. Now, so a lot of people have observed that, and it's often one of the first things people refer to in explaining the importance of reading Hegel and the connection with Marx. And Lenin is often credited with being the first Hegelian Marxist, which is of course a surprise to some people, because you think that that's a whole professory sort of type, and here was the archetypal, the word escapes me, but leader, right? Vanguard leader, not exactly an activist. I mean, everyone knew that Lenin was a smart guy, but to credit him with starting Hegelian Marxism seemed odd, but it's not odd, because, for example, upsurge of interest in Hegel among Marxists from Eastern Europe. It was called Marxist humanism. Marxist humanism, it had about 3 different lives, but you had these people popping up from East Germany and places, and they were all relying heavily on Hegel, because one of the big differences between Hegel and run-of-the-mill materialism is that the idealist Hegel is active. Perception, for instance, is an active process. I see those 2 bottles there, I recognize them as plastic things that are going to foul up the environment while I have my water, through concepts I already have in my head. It's an act, and I grasp that from them. It's not like I've got a screen inside my head and the light projects like light on a screen, you know, giving little images. It's not like that at all. Maybe in a sense a bit like that for an infant, but it's not like that for an adult. So the reason that the critique of Soviet Marxism appeared out of the Soviet Union, hanging on to Hegel for their critique, is because it was against the kind of orthodox Marxism, which Hegel was absent. That being a Marxist wasn't something active. It was your membership of the Communist Party and citizenship of the Soviet Union and your loyalty to the party. There was no active role in that. Right? But to be a revolutionary and to challenge that required emphasising what was active. And that's one of the things which we come to in the philosophical part. Idealism is active. Right? You know, some people, oh, you're just an idealist. You know, you really think you're going to run around, you're going to create these wonderful visions you have. But people aren't like that. The cynical materialists would say, history will roll on in its own way, and you're never going to get people to see your point of view. But the idealist really thinks that through activity they can change the world. But changing the world is an idealist idea. The materialists think the world makes people. Right? So keep in mind. Now, one of the problems with what Lenin said was that he put emphasis on the first chapter, and this has been one of the main things that has put people off the track, because what's described in the first part, that's the first 3 chapters, isn't capitalism at all. I'm going to talk of capital. The first part of capital is about bourgeois society, and in the concepts and elements and relations described in that first part, capital doesn't exist. It's a phenomenal bourgeois society. Also, people that think that Marx is doing a Hegel and thinks he's copying something from the logic rather than having learned a lesson. Losing my point for a second here.
Well, maybe I can bring it back. Maybe let's say that you brought up the idea of idealism and materialism, which is one aspect. Before we even get into that distinction, perhaps let's talk about the different periods that Marx and Hegel both lived. So Hegel is born in 1770, and as a young man, he experiences in Europe the French Revolution of 1789, and accompanying the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the First Empire of France. And this becomes essentially the defining political event of his lifetime. Marx, on the other hand, is born in 1818, and as an even younger man, he experiences the Second French Revolution of 1830, the July Revolution, but then its aftermath in the Revolution of 1848 and the rise of Louis Bonaparte, the nephew, and the Second Empire of France. So both of them are in a sense shaped by events in France, let's say, but as phenomenal of a Europe-wide transformation that's undertaking at the time. How do you understand these 2 periods, the societies, the times that they're living, affecting the way that these 2 thinkers think?
Yeah, well, a lot of people think the idea that social relations, conditions, are determining one's ideas is a materialist idea. And this is not really true. It was Hegel, the idealist, who said every man is the son of his times, and to think that someone can leap out of their times, basically, they can't. That goes on about jumping over roads, is a bit obscure. Give me another prompt.
1776.
1776.
Sorry, 1776 to 1789.
So the world that Hegel grew up in was the sedate country life of Germany. Germany in Hegel's youth, that is out until the Congress of Vienna in 1815, I think, there wasn't Germany, there was the Holy Roman Empire, which was divided into about 300 little princedoms. So you had 300 of these little unique traditional hierarchies with some local prince and their serfs and so on. The Congress of Vienna cut that down to 30. So from Prussia right through to the sort of north of Italy, you had 30 states. But the average population of one of those states is about the population of Greater Newcastle today. Right? So they were tiny. But to the east was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. To the west there was France. Further to the west the British Empire, and to the north the Russian Empire. So you had this little countrified area surrounded by enormously great empires with great conscript armies and empires behind them. But it was at the same time, this was the home of Beethoven and Goethe and Hegel himself and Kant. It had an enormously high development of culture, but culture in that sort of narrow sense, but socially, politically they were completely backward. So there was no, Hegel with some merit believed that progress would happen in Germany through the elite, through a reforming king, and perhaps with a well-meaning and well-educated altruistic bureaucracy that could raise the level of culture through to a condition when people had some degree of freedom. Now, Marx, on the other hand, yes, as a youth, as a 12-year-old, you had the July monarchy. That's it, when it's remembered as the first time the proletariat entered as an actor in its own right into history. It's still only substituted one monarchy for another, because the bourgeoisie stepped in and co-opted the revolution. But Marx, in any case, recognized that it was a movement of the proletariat that surprised itself when it found itself in control of the streets and had nowhere to go, but allowed the bourgeoisie to come in. So but it wasn't so much the effect of that revolution, but what followed in France for the next 18 years. If you've seen Les Miserables, that's 1832. Everyone going to the back barricades, the soldiers coming in, arresting everybody. It was this constant revolutionary ferment that was getting nowhere. So, and Marx loved that, although I will claim a lot of similarity to them philosophically, they were very different personalities. The professor of logic would sternly tell his students not to get involved with politics. And if he had to go and bail them out down at the local jail, he'd give them a stern talking to. And of course, Marx was the opposite. He went to Paris precisely for the pleasure of rubbing shoulders with, he gives this in 1844 manuscript, so he gives this description of the bronzed workers, with their bare shoulders and so on. He loved that, right? And in one of his confessions, this is a game they played, where they got each other to what's your favourite colour and things. His favourite activity was fighting. So there were very different personalities at that sort of level, but the conditions they lived in was, whereas Hegel, with some merit, thought that progress would come through an enlightened elite. Marx believed, because it was all around him, that progress would come through the proletariat. This was an idea that was inconceivable to Hegel. Hegel believed that the masses were stupid, they were a social problem that needed to be patiently educated into political life. He did look forward. His long-term vision was of a constitutional monarchy in which there was the highest possible level of education and so on. But so for the world he lived in, he thought the masses were stupid and couldn't do anything. Marx was the opposite. He rated any proletarian, qualitatively above any middle class person he knew. He really was a bit of a workerist in that sense.
Was it the case though that when you say that Hegel sort of looked down on the masses, were the masses the same thing as the proletariat for Marx?
No, I should make that clear. The structure of the economy in Germany was basically a feudal economy. You had artisans that belonged to their guilds, and Hegel was very interested in these guilds. He regarded them as although they were in decline during Hegel's times and sort of disappeared by the mid-century, he regarded them as a really important part of the constitution. But they were journeymen, apprentices, and masters, right? They weren't a class in that sense. So Hegel's understanding of class was an agricultural class, a business class, and a universal class. The agricultural class was naturally led by the nobility. So the peasants, they didn't get a say. I mean, that was their right as peasants to get certain things from their work in the land. It wasn't, they were represented by the baron or the prince or whoever he might be. To the workers, they were represented in society through their guilds or corporations, as they're referred to in the philosophy of right. And the universal class refers to some educated elite that forms the public service. And universal suffrage is interesting in the sense. Hegel was dead against universal suffrage for all the right reasons, right? The reasons he were against it are absolutely rational. He says that, that people that one single vote doesn't make for anything, people don't bother to vote. In any case, the decisions are always made by a small caucus, right? And the masses are stupid anyway, that they don't understand what they're voting for. They understand their own work. They're very sensible, understand their own work, but they don't understand affairs of state. So they're just going to be manipulated. In France, of course, the universal suffrage was used exactly as a means of manipulating the peasants to keep them against the working class. So universal suffrage was a means of the Bonapartist dictatorship. In England, the workers fought for universal suffrage and had done so since the 17th century. And eventually, by 1848, they'd given up really on getting the vote. But it was very crucial to the British working class. So
Sorry, go. Yeah. Maybe I'll just keep moving on that topic. You mentioned before materialism, idealism.
Yeah.
This is also one way that is both perhaps clarifying, but also can be confusing.
Yeah.
The way that there's sort of a pitting of Marx's materialism against Hegel's idealism.
Yeah. Nothing could be further from the truth. And forget about these two great camps in philosophy, materialism versus idealism. It might have been a very good idea when Engels introduced this conception in the middle of the 19th century as a sort of a pedagogic tool, but that's not the case. I think I've defined about 5 different dimensions in which the contrast between idealism and materialism can be understood. Now, firstly, Hegel defined himself as an idealist because German idealism was a movement in philosophy at the time. And what was going on was Kant realised that Kant found himself on one side with this uncritical empiricism, and the other side, the Humean type skepticism, in which nothing was real at all. So he was not really a part of German idealism, but it was responding to Kant that German idealism arose, and its business was to try and sort out the thought forms with which we could understand the world. And Hegel defines idealism in Neuroscience of Logic something like this. Idealism, every philosophy is an idealism. It's only a question of how far it carries the idealism through. To think that any finite thing has reality, I've got the quote here. I said I wouldn't have to read quotes, but where is the thing? No, not that one. Here we go. The idealism of philosophy consists in nothing else than in recognizing that the finite has no veritable being. Every philosophy is essentially an idealism, or at least has idealism for its principle. The question then is only how far this principle is actually carried out. A philosophy which ascribes veritable, ultimate, absolute being to finite existence as such would not deserve the name of philosophy. In fact, what is only the one concrete whole from which the moments are inseparable. Right? So you know there's a world out there, right? How you want to divide it up, whether it's earth, fire, water, and air, or atoms, or whatever, call it matter. That's point of view. Right? All you know is, you can say absolute is what's out there in the world is one concrete whole. Everything is interconnected. It's the definition of matter, according to Lenin. Right? Lenin put the same thing in good materialist terms by saying that the matter is everything which exists outside of consciousness and characterized by its indefinite interconnection. So Lenin was an idealist in that sense. He just called it matter. So what this leads to is monism. And this is one of the important things that Marx grasps from Hegel is, can I put it, there's only one substance in the world. And it's the problem Kant had, that he ended up saying that everything is an appearance, and the knowledge of what a thing is in itself is impossible. Right? So that's an unsatisfactory situation. But by saying there's only one substance, and everything is made of this one substance, you can get around these continual dichotomies that lead you into all sorts of contradictions and impossible logical circles and so on. Now, the thing is, it doesn't matter whether you call that one substance practice, thought, or matter. It's just the one substance. You can give it any name you like. The name is only useful as far as it distinguishes it from something else. But if your claim is there's only one thing, then call it what you like. But the name you give it, of course, conveys, in a general sense, what you're trying to do. Hegel called that one substance spirit. Now that can be very confusing, but you've been telling me before we started the spirit of our times. These different groups are going on, and the different feelings. Understanding the spirit of our times is a basic starting point for getting into philosophy, also politics. Right? It's a very practical thing. That's to say, you get to know the ideas that are circulating, the general attitude, what's possible and what's not possible. Right? So, Marx was a monist, so he wasn't a materialist, because as he says in the very the very first words of Marxism is thesis one of Thesis on Feuerbach, right? Feuerbach was the very popular materialist of his time. And he says that for the materialists, he says it in several different ways.
Shall I read out thesis one?
Yeah, it's quite a long one, but go for it.
The main defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the object, actuality, sensuousness, are conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as human sensuous activity, practice, not subjectively. Hence, as it appeared that the active side, in opposition to materialism, was developed by idealism, but only abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects, differentiated from thought objects, but he does not conceive human activity itself as objective activity.
Right. And the rest of the theses are only saying this in various ways around. For example, the idea that people are products of their conditions is a classic materialist claim. Oh, these are workers, therefore they'll think like that. This person's a middle class person, they'll think like that. To use a word that's very popular today, agency, which is a terrible word, but it basically takes agency away from things. People are what they're made by their social conditions, and the thing rolls on like an objective process. But if you realise, or what Marx says is, what's forgotten there is that it's revolutionary practice that changes those conditions, right? So the conditions don't just change of themselves, they're changed by people. Of course, people that arise from those conditions, right? They're not changed, well, they may be changed from outside actually. It might be invaded by another country or a blockade might bring about the collapse of those conditions, right? But one way or another, it's human activity that changes the conditions that then, of course, yes, produce people out of those conditions. But the only way of understanding the prospects of change and how history unfolds is by understanding that people change their conditions. And that's an idea of idealists, as I said earlier.
Maybe then, with this category of monism, how do you think of dialectics within that framework? Because the idea that something is not only what it is, but it is also influenced by what it is not, let's say, as a crude way of putting it. But how do you think of Hegel's dialectics and Marx's dialectics? Is there a mapping between them? Are they different? Is there a development?
One thing, I really don't like talking about dialectics. I find that discussions about dialectics never seem to lead to any clarity. Like, it's just a buzzword that people that have never read Hegel or Marx can throw it in to try and say this is complicated, or it's very dynamic, or it's non-linear, and all such phrases that really are just pretensions. So I can't help very much with an answer to what is dialectic, but looking at how Hegel formulated his logic and how Marx formulated his Captial, and what is the big difference between how they went about it, it's that Marx relied on history. He says at one point in the Grundrisse, the real subject lies outside the head. But Hegel suffered from the delusion that he could figure it out. Right? And so to write the philosophy of right, Hegel wrote a logic and then a philosophy of nature beginning from mathematics and physics to vegetable biology, animal life, subjective spirit, the development of psychology in the mind, up to human nature, and then he can write the philosophy, he can write his social theory, because he's already established the forms of movement, the logic of human practice, and the contradictory nature of the human being, right? But Marx doesn't think he has the benefit of this fantastically, internally coherent and comprehensive encyclopedia. What he has got, which is far more useful, is the real history. Now, the thing is that Marx uses history in a way that's different historians use it. And I discovered this myself when I wrote a book called The Origins of Collective Decision Making. And I went about it in the way I learned from Marx. I went back to, I started with the decision making as I knew it, and traced that back to where that began, which turned out to be in, what do you call it, pre-Northern Conquest England, and traced it forward. So I did a genealogy of collective decision making, and that's the sort of history that Marx does. It's a kind of genealogy. But what historians know, that's terrible, because if you take collective decision making as it was, say, in 1828, then this meant this and this meant that, and that's sort of like completely unique moment in history. And you're trying to tie things together that go right back to ancient times to now. This is terrible, this is not history. So a lot of people believe that Capital was written like the Logic, and therefore it begins with an empty concept, and this first chapter is, is just what's the word, an abstraction. The word for this that's used is escaping me for the moment, but it's just a construct, an abstraction.
You think presuppositionless?
No, not presupposition. You've got a point there actually, but it's just an artifact to build up to the next layer. That was the idea that people had.
Scaffolding or something.
Yeah.
Right.
And you put one layer on top of another. So it's just an abstraction, the first one. But because I say rightly that there never has existed a time when commodities were exchanged at their value as described in the first chapter. And that's true in a sense if you're going to be a traditional historian. You can't tell me any point in the thousands of years of history we know about where bourgeois society, that's the name for it, Gesellschaft, existed. But right back even in Greek times, you get Pompeii is now been dug out, and you get these little bars which look just like a coffee bar around the corner here. Obviously, people went and got a cup of coffee, and someone made a living selling cups of coffee, whatever, many centuries ago. Now, that guy selling coffee for a living is no different from a guy selling coffee here, unless he belongs, of course, to a franchise which gets you into something else, because then you're into capital. But someone who's just got something together, makes a little coffee, sells some coffees, makes a living, that's bourgeois society. He's not a member of the ruling class, who the basis of the ruling class in the days of Pompeii is a slave-owning aristocracy, which has a people around it, the purple, whatever, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that word, the ordinary citizens that weren't slaves. So the beginning point of Das Kapital is bourgeois society, and that comes from, it's abstracted from history. And all of the concepts that come like that. Whereas Hegel, he did have an interest in history, but he didn't suffer from the illusion that history was logical, right? Which of course he's often blamed for thinking that history unfolds logically. Of course we know that in the end, sort of logic works out. We drive around in cars now, we don't have horses and carts. And so the discovery of the internal combustion engine can't be abolished until you've got an electric engine, of course. So there is a kind of directionality, but it's not that it works by logic.
All right, so maybe I certainly want to talk more about those, but I realise we've got a bit over time for the first section. But let's see if we take questions on that, and then we'll talk certainly more about bourgeois society and capital in the next section. Yeah. Any questions so far for Andy? Maybe speak up a little bit as well, just for the recording.
I've got a lot of questions. I guess one I'd like to start with, how do you position dialectics within the framework of holism? specifically with the holist claim that the whole cannot be reduced to the sum of its parts. And how do you see ecology in this perspective, in the sense of an ecological civilization?
Yeah, okay. The relationship of whole and part is, of course, a classic sort of dialectical question. It's one of the chapters in the science of logic, whole and part. And generally speaking, so far as something is a real whole, not just a collection of different things, as long as you've got a real whole, then the part is characteristic of that. And all the business about change one bit and you change everything, that's true. That's one of the things that one discovers through reflective thinking about things. Holism, there's always the question of where you draw the bounds, isn't it? What's the relevant whole? See, to write Capital, Marx had to take the economy as a whole, but he's perfectly aware that the whole can't exist, the economy can't exist without a state that enforces the rights implicit in economic life, right? And he was also aware that human life with its state and its economy can't exist without the natural world from which it draws these things. So holism is always a relative question, because if you just say, oh, the whole is like the universe, there's nowhere to go for it, there is no. So if you want to understand something, if you're unhappy with a particular situation, you've got to identify what whole that is a part of and is connected to. Are we suffering from an ecological problem? Well, yes and no, because we've got a big ecological problem, but I don't think that's the whole. It's not the shortage of water or the increasing temperatures which is causing the problem. That's an effect of the real problem, which is human society, human practice as a whole, the world system dominated by capital. That's the whole which is capable of being cracked or going. Now, it may happen because of the side effect of that whole on the ecology, that the ecology will collapse and bring about the collapse of the socio-economic system. Now, so one could say, well, you should see that the real whole, is what the ecologist said, but where does that lead you in terms of doing something about it? Right? You can say, in retrospect, yes, look, the climate collapsed. We lost the conditions for human life, and human society disintegrated along with capitalism and everything else. But just you're not helped by that, because the whole, I would say, which is relevant, is the socio-economic system, which has to be changed. And you're aware that that's a part of nature, and and so on, but it's not. That's not their proper whole. I think we're forgetting a solution to the problem.
Yeah, I think I'd also say maybe in terms of harmony. I feel like in our society, when you relate the part to the whole, I feel like in terms of ecology and harmony, I feel like people are so separate from the sort of whole of society. And I feel like that's sort of what contributes to a lot of our crises.
Well, the connection to the whole has to be really established, doesn't it? The individuals exist only as a part of various wholes. The individuals are sum of ensemble of social conditions. Again, good old thesis on Feuerbach, to be read annually, if not monthly, right? Now I've thrown myself off.
The whole.
The whole. Yeah, look, people are part of a whole, but it's only a relative whole, right? People are part of some class fraction, and the particular way we might choose to dress will be an immediate signal to a whole set of class sort of connections that you're a part of. You're signalling to us that you sympathise yellow shirt, I think, is a kind of a workerist signal, right? So you're acting out that participation in a certain whole. These wholes are, of course, very interconnected now. They're not separate things, you know. The very fact that you sit here in Melbourne expressing your solidarity with the people on the edge of the Mediterranean is an example of how intricate the interconnections are. But we're all part of a whole. And we'll recognise that because, you know, you were here sort of with the slogan that the left is dead, long live the left or something, you know, recognising this an event that's happening as part of a whole, which is called the left. But no one suffers from the illusion that the left isn't part of a wider political universe as well. Yes, Ken.
I suppose, do you think that do you think that Marx's statement, you know, at the beginning of his history of the Second Republic, he says men make their own history, and it seems to me that's often disregarded, that he does actually make, I mean, he then qualifies it, but he does make that statement, obviously.
Oh, but the qualification is really important.
Yeah, the
Otherwise
qualification is obviously important, but it seems to me that concept of that in fact that revolutionary ideas and revolutionary theory can make a difference is critical there.
Absolutely.
But maybe comment on that. But secondly, I just really wanted to know, because I love Marx's histories, what do you think his purpose was in writing those histories? Other than to make some money.
And of course, a lot of his best historical stuff is written commercially to earn a living. His articles for the New York Herald Tribune and so on, where he talks about Bonapartism and imperialism, and generally speaking, not recognise that those concepts came from Marx. I think he sees himself as part of a movement. I mean, he joined socialism in the 1840s. He didn't create it, of course. He joined it, and he identified as part of it. He fought within it against what he saw as alien or misleading ideas, and he was like in the Communist Manifesto is giving voice to a class and a movement that hardly existed at the time, and he's giving a voice for it, and he's trying to, in the process of giving a voice, to give direction. But like you could be an anarchist, a Stalinist, you know, an anarcho-syndicalist, or a social democrat, and still read the Communist Manifesto as being your program. It seems shocking, but you can. Just you know, take a blink, pretend you're a social democrat, and really say, yes, I'm with that. And so while he's writing to try and give direction to the workers' movement, and particularly to inspire it, to give people images that they can fight for, he's very aware of how things don't necessarily turn out like that. He's very conscious of it. And Hegel as well, actually, but Hegel gets beyond himself. The owl of Minerva, this figure, the owl of wisdom, appears in the preface, I think, to the Philosophy of Right. He says that the owl of Minerva takes flight only as dusk or something. In other words, you only get to understand what's going on when the events have already passed. But then Hegel goes on to give the rest of the Philosophy of Right, which is like an ideal state. So he didn't stick to his own rules very much. And at a personal level, nor did Marx, because I really think Marx did think the revolution was just around the corner. But when he was writing and he's doing his work, he didn't act as if the revolution is just around the corner. He was very cautious. So it's my brother. Got to just stop.
Minerva calling.
That's okay. Yes, exactly. just got out of hospital and very nervous about things. I still in hospital, actually. Anyway, you referred to the, what's the thing, the 1850s thing referred to. People then make their own history, but people may not know what the qualification is, only under conditions already existing and inherited from the past. And there's another thing in the 1859, man only tackle problems, the solution for which already exists or is in the process of formation. So there's always this thing that what's making things happening is what people do. So people can make mistakes and they can fail to act when they should, or they can make a breakthrough and open doors for the future. But the opportunities have to be there and they have to be perceived. Yeah?
More questions? No, okay, go for it.
You said that Hegel had some correct rejections of universal suffrage, but from a Marxist perspective, would universal suffrage be beneficial in the sense that it works towards the education of the masses by the participation in political life? Relating it to today, I think our issue with democracy is that the masses are simply not engaged. Casting a vote does nothing. But in this sense, too, is the fight for universal suffrage in itself beneficial?
Well, Marx responds to Hegel's dismissal of universal suffrage by saying it's only a question of how much voting goes on. Marx is for voting everywhere and anywhere you can get it to happen, right?
Yes.
He's not against universal suffrage. He's just aware, as much as Marx was, that it's a means of manipulating the masses and all sorts of terrible things. But I could say definitely today, the world we're living in, it's impossible to imagine an imaginary revolution that did not include universal suffrage, right? It's just impossible. Now, you may have moments, because whenever there's revolution, there's counter-revolution, there's rich people that own newspapers and all sorts of things, and there may be temporary periods when voting is just not the right thing to do. But generally speaking, the program has to include universal suffrage. Now, what Hegel had instead of universal suffrage was a vision of society of very intricate collegial relationships, where your workshop belonged to a local branch of the guild, and you elected the master of that guild and the assistant master, minutes taker and whatever, and gave prizes for the best table that was brought, and you argued over the conditions for apprentices in their thing, and whether so-and-so had transgressed the guild's principles about the low pay, or whether so-and-so was employing too many apprentices and getting beyond himself. And then the guild would be is basically a working class structure within what Hegel called the business section. So he's assuming he was building it out of traditions and ideas and forms of activity which had existed in the past. They were in decline in his own time. So today, yes, you would look at things like unions and ethnic groups, all sorts of areas where people share something in common, work together, have common interests, but they collectively work together as making decisions and then building a structure on them. Right? If I could interpret Hegel for its meaning today, that's what it means. Now, Marx was critical of this because he was aware of corruption. And if you look at the guild movement itself, as early as the 15th century, there were movements about the formation of cliques in the guilds and corruption and so on. So wherever you've got this collegial kind of structure, you have, anyone that's active in the unions knows you get these entrenched bureaucracies, self-serving kind of setups, which is constantly have to be fought against. And didn't see this at all, and his idealism thinks that you can have, you can educate a cadre of civil servants who will be, knowledgeable in philosophy, speak 10 languages and understand economics, whatever, and they will run the country under the direction of the king and the parliament and the estates, and all will be well. And Marx's responses to that within the bureaucracy has a civil society of its own, meaning, corruption, doing people favours, sinecures, all that business. So, did Marx have an answer to that? No, because this is the guy that he waits for history to pose a problem, or at least move towards a problem. Marx doesn't say, oh, you can do it like this. He doesn't write his own philosophy of right. Let's say an ideal socialist society. He wants to see what the actual movement itself produces. So he makes his first comment about a worker state only after witnessing the Paris Commune, where he says that the workers can't take over the state and use it for their own purposes. And he would, so Marx doesn't have a setup. But Hegel thought he could reason it through and draft a kind of perfect constitution for a constitutional monarchy.
Any more questions before we take a short break? All right, let's take 5 minutes or a couple of minutes and give your voice a rest, and then we'll get back to talk about. Well, we touched on some things: bourgeois society, politics, the state. We'll go deeper into that. All right, let me just check the stream. so the second section, a few things I want to talk about. There's certainly lots of things we touched on which I want to go into more detail on. But first of all, you have 2 books coming out, and I'm very interested to understand the motivation for writing them. Perhaps you could just introduce the pair of them and tell us a bit about what brought them on.
Yeah, once I found myself in this location of being a Hegelian Marxist, at some point or other, I had to answer the question of what's the relationship between the logic and capital. The 2 philosophers produced these enduringly important works. So I tried several times, intervals of a few years, to tackle that, but only, I think, just within the past year or so, I managed to do it. Now, others also faced that question, and the turning point was the publication of the Grundrisse in English by Penguin in 1973, and a good translation by Martin Nicholas. And so suddenly, in 1973, when there's a lot of people interested in Marxism, now it's the backside of the 1968 surge, but there's a lot of people interested in reading this great book by Marx. What you find in the Grundrisse is there's an introduction, which has some very interesting stuff in it, and then he does seem to follow the logic, right? Sometimes with explicit quotes and references, but he's talking about political economy, but his closer examination shows that there's a kind of he seems to be reading the logic and discussing political economy. Now, the Grundrisse was written between 1856 and 1857 during a downturn in political events. In 1859, he publishes Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Now, the thing is that when you look at the 1859 book, you can see the basic shape of capital is beginning to emerge. When you look at the Grundrisse doesn't look anything like capital. Right? So the first thing I had to deal with is people that said the Grundrisse is a copy of the logic, and that therefore Marx's political economic views are based on the logic, and therefore even though they're not made explicit in the capital, obviously it's all based on Hegel. And there's one fellow that actually, I put a big slug in my book criticising this guy, and I won't remember his name like that, but he actually died during the time I was writing it. I feel bad that I've really given this guy a bad go. And then the 2 people that push in this barrow, that the Grundrisse is an image of the logic, both died within the last couple of years. But this was an important move, right? So it generated a lot of interest in the question. But then people start saying, well, what about capital? And still people continue to try and say that this bit of the capital, this bit of the logic is reproduced in this bit of capital as a kind of, they have a homology, meaning that they're the same shape, right? Even though the words are different, the concept of it have the same shape. There's one fellow, Christopher Arthur, who's probably the best of them in a way. It makes a very detailed one-to-one connection between the logic up to a little way into the second book of the logic, let's say probably about halfway through, and the first part of Capital, which is, you remember, is only about bourgeois society. Capital hasn't yet appeared there. And he makes great claims to this. Now, I think they're completely wrong. The idea that Marx would, the kind of knockoff version of substituting economic concepts for logical concepts and publish it under his own name, this what an insult. You know, and also, particularly Meany's name was, Brian, Dave, Jeff, somebody, Meany, who claimed, I think, about 300 different one-to-one connections between the Grundrisse and very, very much in the eye of the beholder. It's a complete subjective construction. And generally speaking, the people that do this don't understand and not particularly interested in Hegel. They're all Marxists. They're all professors of political economy, Marxists, and they've snapped little bits of Hegel here and there. Not so much, say, Chris Arthur, he's a bit better. But they're really Marxist, and it's the nature of the academy that people go into silos, and they work through those silos. And you know, this is the physics building, I think, and the chemistry building's over there. And God knows how they managed to do physical chemistry. There'll be another building for that, maybe. So you had people that knew about Marx, knew a little bit about economics, maybe. Geert Reuten, who's I also devote a lot of time to criticising. He was actually a member of the Senate in Holland and a professor of political economy as well, and he does these things. So mostly they just know one thing and are making guesswork about the others. Well, funnily enough, in my life, the way it worked out is I didn't know much about economics, but I had taken the trouble to understand Hegel and Marx. So the first book is really, it's about this thick, and it's rather tedious, because I take 10 of these people, I think, and I tear strips off them as best I can. So it's very repetitive, very pedantic, and you know, it seems to be pointless because what they're saying.
Well, you've sold it. You've sold
Oh,
it.
yeah. I'm waiting for the film.
And I basically take them at their word and try and show that this is nonsense, right? It doesn't work. So I don't go along with my reading and say, look, no, it's not like that, it's like this. So it's an imminent critique of each of them. But it's still the imminent critique could be rather tedious. By the time then I've got what all these guys have spent. I mean, I remember when I first put up the Hegel by Hypertext website in 1997, I got interaction with a fellow called Tony Smith, who was writing this stuff then, and now it's 28 years later, and he's still doing it, you know. And I at least give myself the credit that I haven't stayed in one place for 28 years. In Melbourne, yes, but intellectually no. So, I try to do an imminent critique. For the people that are into that discipline, they'll be interested to read it, and it was necessary for me, because the first time I wrote what I thought, and I showed it to some people that claimed to know about this sort of stuff, and they tore shreds off it. So I hadn't taken account of what so-and-so said, and so-and-so said this, and you don't understand that, and you didn't mention this. So I had to actually read all the stuff that other people say and show why I don't go along with it. So then I made quite a little book about this big. I had to get up to 100 pages for it to be published. They won't, what's the name? Brill won't take anything under 100 pages. So in the preface, I look at the three component parts of Marx's Captial, right? Referring to Lenin's famous three component parts of Marxism. The first is Hegel's logic, specifically the idea of cognition, which I haven't mentioned yet, which I'll have to, because it's become an important part of how I see Hegel and Marx. So he used Hegel, but he didn't use the part of Hegel that all these other guys were talking about. None of them, Chris Arthur mentions it as an aside, this second last chapter of the logic, right? And he misunderstood it, right? But no one saw any importance to it, right? So that's the first thing. That's the section of the logic which Hegel used as the logic to write the encyclopedia, to write all the sciences, right? So it would make sense that if you're interested in Hegel's logic, you'd use that chapter to write your critique of political economy. So that's the second component, is he took the existing writing about political economy and made an imminent critique. what Hegel did with logic. He took the existing literature on logic and he made an imminent critique of it. And it's quite brilliant, actually, but perhaps that's for another day. In Marx's critique of political economy, he said David Ricardo's got the right idea. If it's to become a science, it has to be a science of value. But what Ricardo then does is he introduces a number of other things that then mixes it all up, right? And including taking as an empirical given to start with that the rate of profit is uniform, right? And the fact is that the labour theory of value, which comes out of the history of political economy, and the uniform rate of profit to capital are contradictory. They cannot both be true at once, right? And all the political economists could never come to grips with that. And this is a very similar situation that Hegel faced in his critique of the logic before him. So, and the third component part is history. And as I say, Marx doesn't make history in the sort of sense that historians understood. He does it by genealogy. So any particular concept, let's say, when I say a concept, form of activity, thing that exists in the world and doesn't exist in people's head, it exists in the way people interact. So a concept is a form of activity, right? And they have a history. Someone invented doing this, and then someone improved it, and so it goes on down the world. Every form of activity, such as capital or price or wages, all these things have history, and they're never the dominant form of activity in a particular form of society, except for capital, of course, which at the end of the day becomes the dominant form, the dominant concept. But following these things through their history gives you a way of understanding their actual logic, because in history, forms of activity are tested out, and they're pushed to their limits, and at a certain point found wanting, and they're changed. That's the dialectic, right? The form of activity, because you asked me about dialectic before, sorry, a form of activity makes sense, right? But then conditions push that to its limit, right? And then it doesn't make sense suddenly, and it has to be corrected, and you change that. So you have a concept that kind of changes to a different concept. And that's what's happening in the logic. I mean, in the logic, it's just done through thought, not done by looking at history. It's done by logic. Okay, so Marx had these three elements, and what came out of it is a wonderful sort of structure. And I'll do a summary of it, because the last time I spoke on this, I did it in 25 minutes actually, but it's totally bewildering. But firstly, there are three parts to capital. Not parts, actually, three ethical realms. The first realm is bourgeois society, in which goods are sold at their value, that is to say, the amount of average mental labour time required to produce each commodity. Then you've got productive capitalism, which covers from the second part of the first volume right up to the end of the second volume. Right? That's the majority of those capital. It's productive capitalism. And in productive capitalism, it turns out, by the time you get to the end of it, in the beginning of volume 3, that the goods are sold at the price of production plus profit. Profit calculated as a percentage of capital. Now that can't be, well, that can only be consistent with goods being sold at their value under very exceptional conditions that every industry requires exactly the same amount of fixed capital to produce a product. And it's highly exceptional, doesn't happen. So there's a contradiction happens there. Right? So goods sold at their value, goods sold at cost price plus profit, and then there's a third part, which is finance capital, and there goods aren't exchanged at all. You can borrow them, and then you And if you wasted your time and didn't make a profit, that's your problem. You've still got to give back more, right? So the finance capital is completely disconnected from the process of production at all. It's pure capital. It produces interest out of itself. So here we have, like in the philosophy of right, where you have three, I call them ethical realms, I don't know a better word for them. You have persons with rights. Rights, what are usually called human rights, that is to say, the right to own property and to a bodily autonomy, right? And not to be enslaved, for example. Then you have the morality of subjects, a subject who consults his own conscience in order to decide what's the right thing to do for their own welfare, having a mind to the welfare of others. And then you have ethical life, which is the customs of the society objectified in the state and law. Now, in any modern society, you have these three things coexistence. The right of the individual, the conscience of the subject, and the ethical institutions, and they all sort of clash. That's why lawyers and priests always have work to do, because they're always clashing. And that's happening in capital as well, that it's not a thing. So that's one level of capital. The next level is that between volumes 1, 2, and 3, he actually does a syllogism, and it's quite explicit. Volume 1 is the immediate production of capital. So you employ people and you rip off a bit of surplus by selling the product at a profit, right? And then you repeat that process. And you're never worried about where the products come from, or who's going to buy, or where you're going to get the workers from. It's just that you employ people, you pay them for their labour time, and sell the product more dearly. That's in volume 1. In volume 2, takes account of the fact that this activity has to reproduce the conditions for its own existence, and Marx theorizes this by the idea of a circuit of capital, where you have some workers there, you buy their labour power, you turn them into products with productive capital, factories and things, and then you sell it to a commercial capitalist who gets that into money, and the money comes, and the workers can eat as well, and you can renew the material to your factory, and it makes a cycle. But each cycle is considered like a little bit of capital on its own. It's like, I remember seeing a movie called La Ronde. It was about someone gives a venereal disease to someone else, and it passes on, and eventually at the end of the movie, the person that started it comes back and meets the first person. It's a bit like that. So capital value is going down to the circuit that functions to renew the whole society. And then in the third, he takes the what's it called, capitalist production as a whole. He takes the first immediate production and that circulation and puts them together, so that value is now distributed between the capitalists in different industries, right? By value is passing backwards and forwards between capitalists by selling things other than their value, but according to cost price plus profit, and likewise passing on value to the landlords and so on as well. And then the thing, others may have noticed these things, I don't know, I haven't seen it, but they're so obvious you couldn't help but read them. But what I particularly discovered was that in the 18 parts of Capital, each part is typically 2 or 3, maybe 4 chapters. Each part has a particular structure. There is a unit or a germ cell, which is just simply like stated as a fact, and then critically examined. So in the first part, which is bourgeois society, you have commodities. The wealth of all existing capitalist societies or something is made up of commodities. There's an enormous accumulation of commodities, something like that. So this is a fact. then he analyses commodities. And that's, of course, the most important part of the thing, but as I've said before, that doesn't give you capital. And that went on for thousands of years, literally, without producing capital. Or not capital, it produced usurers and call it commercial capital, but it didn't produce wage labour. It didn't produce what we're living in now. So that was the germ cell. In the beginning of the second part, he introduces what he calls money bags, or Mr. Moneybags. And he's someone that buys goods and sells them more dearly. That's the minimal description of him. So suddenly there appears in bourgeois society this character who does that. He buys things and he doesn't sell them at their value, he sells them more dearly. And then you have to inquire, how is this possible? And the universal instance of Mr. Moneybags is the one that buys labour power. There are also the usurer and the sort of merchant as well. But the universal, so you notice again that we're getting this little concept, the germ cell, and then we discover the universal and particular moments of that, which allow it to build it up into something more complex. Yeah? In terms of things are particular, they're not really quite included, like the commercial capitalist doesn't make their money by exploiting labour power. They may exploit labour power, but basically they do it by realising capital that originally created in productive capital and so on. And so I go through all these, and the last couple of chapters in the last couple of parts in volume 1 and the last part in volume 3, I can't fit it into that structure. It's where Marx, and there'll be occasional chapters here and there that deal with miscellaneous topics, historical reflections of some kind, but they're not essential to the structure. And what I've written, I haven't gone in to any of the kind of apparatus that can be built on top of capital. Like there's a lot, we all know that capital produces a certain kind of thinking in people, right? I haven't gone into that at all because I think I want to just put it out there that this is, he used Hegel and this is how he used it. What do you make of that? Okay, so I'm not an economist, and I could probably go on writing about this for a long time. I want to put it out there because no one has seen this before, and everyone will be barking up the wrong trees. So I want to show that this is what Marx was doing. So have a think about that and see what it comes of. And just finally, my reason for doing this is partly because I really had to, because I've spent so much important part of my life between Hegel and Marx. At some point or other, I have to show how the two are really doing the same thing and where they don't, right? But also, I want to show how these two great figures, great thinkers and actors in the world, how they did their work so that I can use those insights for other purposes, such as the economic crisis, so the ecological crisis, such as capitalism as it is today, such as the fragmentation of the working class, the rising forward of new classes. You know, there's a lot of problems that are confronting us now, and this idea, which is first put forward in the second last chapter of the logic, is used by my friend Lev Vygotsky, the Soviet psychologist, to make about 5 different branches of psychology based on this germ cell method, and there are some Soviet thinkers that use the germ cell in all their work, but for different reasons they have their limitations. But they've got an element of truth there, so I want to take hold of and show how the masters use it.
So you talked a lot there, particularly about bourgeois society, and you gave this example in the first part tonight. You were talking about in Pompeii, wherever, that there was this coffee bar that was discovered, and one is tempted to imagine that selling goods and trading goods in, ancient Greece had somewhat of a similar character to the present. But you just said that perhaps the bourgeoisie wasn't in power, it was slave-holding aristocracies and so on. So that would raise the question of what is bourgeois society, in the sense of, is it a society that is ruled by the bourgeoisie, or is there a different conception of society at the common level? Do people recognize themselves subjectively in society different in, let's say, the 1750s onwards, or the 1500s onwards even, compared to 600 BC? Is there a sense of freedom that is different in modern society, different to the ancient society? On top of that question, how would you understand the change in that character of freedom between Hegel's time and then Marx's time? Is it a different freedom problem, or is it the same freedom problem that Hegel was talking about?
Both of them define freedom as the central character that was the object of their philosophy. They're both defined by their followers as philosophers of freedom. So that's the interesting point. And of course, in the little comment I made about the coffee bar in Pompeii, I risk getting really dumped on by a skilled historian, because it sounds like I'm implying that the consciousness of the barista in Pompeii is the same as the consciousness of the barista out in Swanson Street here. And of course, a historian will easily show me that this is far from the case, right? And this is the thing that I had difficulty with my reception of my book on collective decision making. The business of, can put bourgeois society in the translations of the philosophy of right into English, they don't say bourgeois society, they say civil society. And then that's not satisfactory either, because civil society generally doesn't include corporations, big companies. It really refers to volunteer organisations and charities and things like that, right? If I'm not mistaken, but
it wouldn't just be necessarily the institutions either, it would actually be the social relations. The way that people understand each other, respect property rights, laws, morality.
Of course, the institution and social relations don't see any separation there at all, but that's neither here nor there. So, in what I've written, I've made no claims about that, about gone into how bourgeois society shapes the consciousness of its participants. Obviously, that will be very different in Pompeii as it would have been in Hegel's Germany or Marx's or now, because this is just one shape, and it's a one kind of field for philosophers to philosophize about how being known for your products, what you produce, and being valued according to what you produce, or not, right? How that affects one's identity, and it's just, well, I could talk about that, but at the moment, or maybe you'd like me to.
I'm picking up from the earlier discussion, just to thread it in. Hegel actually, I think, was deluded when he said that the market was something emancipatory, because when people saw their own goods circulating on the market, then they saw their own value. So there's a basic idea in Hegel that if you make something, that's nothing. But if you make something that's useful to someone else, and it's recognized in some way, for instance, by paying you for it, for example, right, then that is a proof, in a sense, to you that you exist. Right? Likewise, to have private property, like a room that you can go into, and people have to knock to come in, right, is important to establish one's identity as a person. If you live in a house where anyone can walk into your bedroom without knocking, you don't really feel you're a proper person, right? So particularly the act of selling labour is constitutive of how you
see yourself as a person. Now, we know that in bourgeois society, when it gives way to productive capitalism, that workers are not paid according to the value of their product, that they're paid according to their labour time, and more specifically, whatever they need in order to survive. So workers learn, when ordinary bourgeois society, which hasn't existed as such for a long, long time, because capital has completely subsumed the labour process. But so now workers find that their worth is measured not by what they produce, and people will tell you, oh look, I did all this, and what do I get? I can't even get my kids, into school, even though I built this bloody school. People will often reflect that they're not paid according to their contribution. They're just paid according to their class. They're paid for, I'm a plumber, so I'll get paid according to what a plumber gets paid. And so consciousness is then formed, not as Hegel supposed, according to the great value of your product, because in Hegel's time, bourgeois society did exist. It hadn't been subsumed under capitalism in Germany. It had in England, but not in Germany. You still had masters with journeymen and apprentices, and limits on how many journeymen a master could employ. Because if he employed too many, he'd be in danger of becoming a capitalist. And public opinion in Hegel's day was opposed to that. People getting too rich and so on. So I'm off the track.
No, I think it's probably a good time to get questions as well.
Yeah.
I don't actually have a clock on me, so I can't tell.
22.
Okay, good, perfect. So any questions for this second section or about Andy's book? Ken scratching his head.
So much stuff to take in.
Yeah. Much too much stuff.
No.
Maybe I'll ask another one, reflecting on Ken's earlier question about history. I mean, in some sense, you talked about Marx's sort of genealogical history. I would also be interested in a kind of philosophic history, in the sense that Hegel has this line in that world history is progress in the consciousness of freedom. And what the task is to recognize the necessity of that. And Ken asked about a kind of logic to history. Is it that one is not necessarily the case that there is kind of an unfolding logic in the kind of mechanical sense, but rather that human species, bourgeois subjects, could perceive and could narrativize history.
Everyone has to recognize that there is a long sense in history. That stupid things happen today. You might have a whole decade or lifetime of stupid things happening, where things go backwards and people do all the wrong things and so on. But in the long haul of history, there is some kind of sense to it, right? Even though you might say, oh, the 20th century was a complete mistake, there's been a lot of basis for that. Nevertheless, it invented the motor car, it invented all sorts of medical procedures. It raised the amount of, it did a lot of things, right? So the thing is that Hegel thought it was the great thinkers, the great historical figures like Napoleon that created new states and established new laws, and the philosophers who gave voice to the spirit of the time. Hegel does think that the history of philosophy has logic to it, right? But not history itself.
Regarding the 20th century, yes, the 20th century did deliver all kinds of technical marvels, but can we actually say that the consciousness of history has progressed? Sorry, consciousness of freedom has progressed. Are we clear about the world historic task of freedom that we were perhaps at the turn of last century?
You can write books and libraries answering that question in both ways there, right?
Well, what do you think, though? Do you think have we progressed in the consciousness of freedom?
We've made progress and we've lost ground as well, I am by personality an optimist, right? So side in anything. I don't think I could carry on otherwise. But of course, there's enormous negatives. You take the way people are talking about AI. This is just an example of under the conditions of capitalism and the inability of people through states to rationally regulate, that's going to do an enormous amount of damage. But it can also, I use it myself, and I use it even in writing philosophy. I'll use a bit of AI. You've got to be careful, of course, because it can make huge mistakes and be embarrassing mistakes. But that's it. The motor cars has made possible to have a city like Melbourne of 6 million people living together. What happens when you get 6 million people that can talk to each other in the course of a day, who they choose? I mean, the numbers, you take human beings and give them interaction at that degree of activity. Wonderful things happen. The motor car also, of course, has completely fucked the planet, and kills people and so on. But so every new Marx did think that the labour process was the thing, but the labour process basically continued to move forward. Right? Okay, reverses, but went forward. And when a labour process makes a breakthrough, like inventing the motor car, you don't forget how to make a motor car. It continues. And then you realise that this internal combustion engine is a real problem. Actually, we'll have electric motors for a time. They're much easier to make than that, and so we're now getting electric cars. So that's in the labour process. In his early writings, Hegel did pay more attention to the labour process, but he didn't follow that up. He got much more into the emancipatory value of different philosophies and laws. What you mainly needed, which he had until 1817, was a reforming king who would pass good laws, and that's how progress would happen. Right? So both of them understand that progress comes forwards and backwards, one step forward, two step backwards. And anyone with a head on their shoulders understands that progress isn't just a straight thing. It's
yes, but in some sense that so for Marxism, the task Marx would grasp to comprehend that progress in history in capitalism would require the overcoming of capitalism. That in some sense, capitalism has become disintegrative of freedom in a kind of unconscious developing way. Like we are losing more and more control over our society, that we now experience more and more aspects of society as sort of forces of nature, as sort of the irrational outside GFC kind of events. And so freedom I would argue for Hegel and someone like Marx is not whether the degree of personal freedom and capabilities, plane travel, telephone communication, whatever, but rather how do we perceive humanity as a social species shaping our own trajectory? Do we feel like history is happening to us? Do we experience technologies like AI as a catastrophe rather than an emancipatory event?
But Marx and Hegel were very similar in the sense that writing in the early part of the 19th century, Hegel was a critique of liberalism. To understand, he was critiquing the big progressive philosophy that would mark the 100 years that came after the development of liberalism, because he was a critique of individualism. And Marx, of course, likewise was a critique, to say the least, of individualism. He saw freedom coming through, or I prefer emancipation, I don't know, same thing. It had to be a collective effort that brought freedom to a collective. And although Hegel saw, this business about being changing conditions, though under conditions received from the past, Hegel saw that in terms of the elite figures, great philosophers, thinkers, whatever, who had that situation. They would inherit a certain social formation, certain cultural level, and they would have to, in that cultural environment, make them step forward. So there's not a difference between Marx and Hegel there. The thing is that what Marx saw was basically the labour process and the people that constituted that labour process. I mean, I had this line in my text for this: who built Hadrian's Wall? Right? And this is a nice line. It was given to me by a teenager in East London his father was one of these classic sort of English artisans, you know, that have been socialist for 10 generations. He's obviously picked this up. And it was really nice because Hadrian's Wall was apparently built by Hadrian, but we all know that he never probably picked up a brick in his life. It was, you know, probably some English peasants that under the lash of the Roman troops built it. And the thing is that it's the idealist that thinks it's Hadrian's Wall, and it's the materialist that thinks it's the English peasant's wall. Right? But there's truth in both, isn't there? Yeah. I mean, if it hadn't been Hadrian, there never would have been a wall there. They would have got on with the Scots instead.
Any
If
more
possible.
questions? Have you got a question?
Talking to McAlpine here.
I've just got one sort of meta question, and don't take too long if you think it's a tangent, but I must say I find debates about, any debates about Hegel extremely difficult because of the difficulty of his language. So if two people are arguing about what Hegel said, or about what Hegel meant, it's extremely hard. It's like, it might as well be in ancient Chinese, and you've got two translators, one of whom says he means a camel, and the other one says it means a horse, and I have no way, in that situation, I have no way of knowing whether they're both wrong, one's right, or something else, and this is a problem, I think, which impedes impedes the advance in this area that you're obviously trying to make, is that as a person who doesn't come to it with any particular preconceived notions, I find Hegel utterly impenetrable.
And Hegel's to be blamed for that. It's partly the times. It was like someone said to me, Andy, to be a German professor of philosophy, you have to have your own system. I was critiquing this guy, Axel Honneth, and he started off quite well in a debate with Nancy Fraser, talking about the importance of recognition. But after a few years, everything was recognition, and it was a waste of time. So, in a certain sense, Hegel responded to what was demanded of a professor of philosophy of his time, and they loved it. His students were avidly taking notes and so on. But to read it today, you might as well be writing in Chinese. So the main thing I try to do with my book is to translate it into the language of say, Hegel for social movement, not Hegel on social movement. I don't think he ever wrote anything about a social movement. But for people that are interested in changing the world, making the world a better place, then you'd be interested in Hegel. I'll give you a way to read him. So it's not written as a discourse on philosophy at all. And I think anyone that wants to give you a lecture on the phenomenology is really doing something else, because if Hegel is difficult, phenomenology is even more difficult, and Hegel himself ends up not agreeing with what he wrote in the phenomenology anyway. It's not his finished form, it's his first published book, and he had piles of it, the first edition at home, he'd given away to friends as a gift, right? Whereas the shorter logic was the book he used for his lectures, and was revising it and ironing out the rough corners right to the day he died. And that's the word where Marx and Lenin, if they're reading Hegel's logic, that's what they're reading. They're reading the shorter logic. They're not reading phenomenology. That was something that came about in France in the 1930s and after the war through, what's his name? Hippolyte was okay. And it's a pretense, it's a philosophical pretense in my view. Look, talk about, for instance, psychology or political economy. It won't. It's marginal use. So with my book, it's written like, before you read the next page, read such and such, read the first 10 pages of the introduction of logic or something. And then the next page, before you read the next one, read the section on being. So it's meant as a companion, because if you hear what I say, yeah, okay, and he's got his point of view, but then, someone else is something different. Where do you go? So you have to get your own Hegel, right? But I really got my Hegel more or less on my own, as I say, by Lenin's annotations, which in the end weren't all that useful to me, but it got me started. Then talking to people on the internet that visited the site after I transcribed it, and then holding summer schools where I had some real Hegelians came to speak and listening to them. And, I've learned it on the run like that. And now that means that sometimes my knowledge is not as good as a professor of Hegelian philosophy should be. And I don't know, I don't read his work in German, and therefore I'm absolutely banned from publishing in the Hegel Society Bulletin. You read him in English? How can you do that? I mean, I'm just some sort of rougher, rough kid outside, and like people, that if you actually get into Hegel, which is what Hegel scholars are interested in, it's incredibly arcane. I remember listening to a couple of people talking in a break during the Australian Hegel Society conference a few years ago, and they're all talking about the absolute. That's never closer to concrete reality than their opinion of the absolute. I think it means God.
Right.
Did you have another question, Bailey? Or?
He's typing it up now.
No, I have a few questions. I guess my first question related to this sort of speech was that I think that one of the most important concepts of the logic is that of quantity and quality. In this sense, when people argue that Captial is a copy of the science of logic, would you say that they are arguing from a quantitative perspective? Moreover, is it possible that the qualitative connection is thus undervalued, and that while Captial is uniquely Marx's work, there is a real connection that is overlooked, while the false connection on quantity is what people focus on?
Well, the relationship between quantity and quality in about paragraph 106 or 107 in the logic, it's a nice little relationship which is easy to explain, understand. Something this high might be a dog kennel, it's not a house. Something this high might be a house. If it's 50 foot tall, it's not a house. It's a block or something, right? So the simple variation of quantity leads to changes in quality. Now, imperfectly as it may have been, in 30 seconds I've explained the dialectic of quantity and quality. It's not hard to grasp. And Hegel didn't spend a lot of time on it, quite honestly. Oh, he did. I'm lying there. He spent, that's in the shorter logic. In the science of logic, he split that out into about 10 different stages, right? But it's only a small part of the whole work. And I wouldn't say to me the most important one, because if you can't understand that the change of quantity eventually leads to a qualitative change, then you shouldn't be active in talking or writing, right? It's not something that Hegel discovered. It's just, everyone knows that. But if you come up against particularly dogmatic people that refuse to see that, when 300,000 people march through Sydney, this is not a manifestation of anti-Semitism. This is a real movement. People refuse to see that something that is quantitatively so distinct represents a new quality. Then you can sort of say that, but I don't think you need Hegel for that.
Any other questions, or did you have another one, or is that one last one to wrap it up?
I have one last question, which is kind of what I've been interested in myself at the moment. But my question is, how do you make sense of democratic centralism? I think that it is an inherently dialectical relationship. In State and Revolution, Lenin argues for a voluntary centralism as opposed to bureaucratic and militaristic centralism. Lenin also argues that this centralism is the organization of national unity. And I think maybe with reference to sort of like the part and the whole, I think it's dialectical in that sort of sense.
Well, everything is dialectical, that's the point. But yeah, it's good to read these debates by people who are very skilled and immersed in organisation in the workers' movement and the concept of democratic centralism. It's like a sort of a nodal idea that sums up a certain stage in the development of class consciousness. But at the same time, you know, talk about quantity is equality. We're not living in 1930. You know? I'll give my personal view here. In my view, the political party, like the proprietary limited business, belongs to an earlier epoch. Just as much as the corner shop is a thing of the past, so is the Revolutionary Party. Even the World Party of Socialist Revolution is about as real as the corner shop, because the corner shops are all gone, because that is a formal organisation that made sense even in the capitalism that I found when I came back to Australia in the 1980s. You could get your bottle of milk, a packet of fags from the corner shop. It doesn't exist any longer. You get your socialism by a little party. But I think that the socialism cannot arise in that way. This is me talking absolutely personally for myself. I've not written on this. It's a difficult question to argue. But in my view, socialism or the social revolution will happen only by the participation of the overwhelming majority, and there is no single class in the formation we have today which constitutes the overwhelming majority. So consequently, the idea of forming a party which is an organic part of a class, like Lenin saw the Bolshevik Party as an organic part of the industrial working class, newly emergent in Russia, but because of its historical position, was worth far more than the 3% population that it constituted. But that is past thing. The industrial working class, by kind of an abstract way, is voting for Trump or right-wing fragments. I say in an abstract way because, of course, insofar as the blue-collar working class, industrial working class, exists as a class, it doesn't. It supports socialism. But the thing is that class doesn't any longer have that class consciousness, right? So I can observe as an empirical given fact that most people working in manual or industrial jobs are not progressive. Many of them are, and the best are, honestly, But, and secondly, to necessarily qualify what I said first, the social revolution cannot be made without the participation of the industrial working class, simply because they'll kick your heads in if they're not part of it. You've got all these revolutions that happen in Georgia or somewhere, these progressive young kids that want to get democracy. Well, actually, what happened in Nepal is an interesting exception to the rule, but as yet unfinished. But unless you've got the industrial working class with you, you simply don't have the physical force to overcome the state. But the working class that Marx knew is no longer. It was at the time, from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, the progressive force in society, both intellectually in its ideas, and manifested all sorts of great intellectuals that wrote wonderful novels and books on various theories and artwork and all sorts of things, and the instrument, the idea that if the working class was emancipated, then everyone would have to be emancipated. we have to be able to mobilise. I mean, where's a left-wing party that has a majority of industrial working class people as its members? I don't know, I haven't seen one for a long, long time. But for instance, my parents were members of the Communist Party. They belonged to the writers' branch. And all the intellectuals and writers were stuck in that branch so they could talk to each other and not cause trouble with the dockers and engineers and things who were kept in completely different branches. But the Communist Party was overwhelmingly a blue-collar workers' union. And it had these wonderful intellectuals undertow that wrote and, if you like, were heroes on the cultural level in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. But they were a blue-collar party, and things didn't stay like that. The Labour Party, up until I can remember reading someone's memoirs that said, they said up to 1948, when you went to a Labour Party meeting, you'd find yourself surrounded with blue-collar workers. Nowadays, they're all lawyers. And so that person was putting it back as far as 1848, I mean 1948. So there's two things. The socialist revolution will be made not by a party as the organic leader of any one class, but by the working class. It'll be done only by the organisation of effectively everybody. Needs qualification of everybody. Obviously don't mean the big bourgeoisie. Secondly, it cannot be done without the organised working class.
Can I ask that?
Yeah.
So what is left of Marxism without the party?
That's
To
why
maybe just one point, do you see then this sort of this re-engagement with Hegel as potentially a trajectory to socialist revolution that doesn't go through the necessity of a party?
Yeah, look, I didn't start off with this idea about a party being one of the mistakes of the 20th century. It's along with Ken, went through some experience that I remember the last time, before we were both members of the Greens, the last time we sat in a meeting was the Melbourne branch of the Progressive Socialist Party, and my girlfriend was elected to the fundraiser, and there's this Croatian woman that was the treasurer who wouldn't release any money because, whatever. It was a farce, right? Because my girlfriend was never going to be a party member active in any case. So that was that's a diversion. I'm sorry, to get back to the thing. Reframe your question again.
So do you see Hegel as a route to socialism without a party?
Yeah, look, you can't really say you're a Marxist unless your central sort of thesis is a socialist revolution led by the industrial working class, because that's what Marx was about. But at the same time, if you want to be a socialist, you've got to see that the world has changed. So how do you do that? Well, as I say, the first thing I went back is go back before all this Marxism business and start reading Marx himself when he's talking about the world he was actually in and not something imagined, and then actually necessary to find the philosophical roots, because he himself was a young Hegelian, even though he's fighting against them and criticising them. That was the nature of political activism in those days, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yes, it's necessary to generalise from Marxism on a basis of understanding the philosophical roots of it, so that you can carry out the task that socialism set itself under conditions where it may be possible today. Because pursuing an objective which is no longer possible because the task for whom it was the vehicle no longer exists cannot possibly be part of Marxism. So, like all traditions, every generation has to critique what's gone before, and it's good that we study the history of Marxism. We learn about democratic centralism. That's not going to be an answer to you. There's a lot more you have to learn about getting collective decisions than democratic centralism, but it's understanding that as a part of our movement, as opposed to other ways of making a collective decision. It's important, but you've got to be able to, you learn from the history of the movement, but don't, for Christ's sake, please, just repeat it when it's already passed. So, yeah.
All right.
You know, I got attracted to you guys because I saw you holding discussions between different groups that didn't agree with each other. I was attracted to that. As you know, I came along to one of your branch meetings, and then I suddenly thought I was in a time warp, and it was 1970 again, so I didn't ever join you, and I won't. But I do appreciate the work you're doing on the left, of getting people to talk to each other and having debates. And you might, what's his name, that guy that was got assassinated you on the other side of things.
Well, let's all give Andy a round of applause. And yeah, Platypus runs reading groups on campus, and we have plenty of materials over here. And yes, Andy's book is available. No, your first book. Your next two books are out next week. Is that what?
Yeah.
That would be a
the
big
books on Captial and Logic come out next week in Holland, so I'll get, it's published in Holland, right? And then the paperback comes out in New York a year later, but the text is available off my website. I flagrantly, rip off my own intellectual property. They never complain, so those two books there, they're 20 bucks each.
And in there, having read it, in there, I agree, you'll find a very active Hegel. You won't find the sort of passive.
That's right.
Hegel
for people, for the struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thanks again, Andy.
Thank you.
And we're going to the pub as well for lunch or dinner again.
Unfortunately, I can't join you.
You can't join us? Oh, it's all over.
Thinking I would. I have a niece who needs some attention.
Understand.